The wheelchair hit the edge of the desk so hard the pen cup toppled, and Caroline Prescott didn't even look down at the mess of ink and paper clips scattering across the hardwood. Her eyes were fixed on the frame in her lap, knocked loose from where it always sat facing her, never facing the door. "Get out," she said, and her voice didn't rise. It just went flat and cold, the way a held door slams shut without anyone touching it. The woman standing across from her, the fourth agency assistant in 6 weeks, was already reaching for her coat. Nobody in that house had learned yet that Caroline Prescott didn't yell when she was angriest. She went quiet, she went still. And in that stillness was something so absolute that people fled it faster than they'd have fled a shout. What none of them had thought to ask, in 6 weeks of resumes and reference checks and careful interviews, was who that little girl in the photograph was, and why Caroline Prescott could not bear to have anyone look at her too closely. To find out how one man finally asked the right question, stay until the very end. If you've ever watched someone build a wall so high that even kindness couldn't get over it, you already understand why this story matters. And if that's you tonight, we're glad you're here with us. 3 years ago, none of this existed. There was no wheelchair, no ramp built hastily into the east wing of the Prescott estate, no rotating cast of assistants who lasted 11 days on average before quitting. 3 years ago, Caroline Prescott was simply the youngest CEO in the history of Prescott Analytics, a data infrastructure company her father had built from a single server room into a firm valued past $4 billion. And she ran it the way she skied, the way she did everything, at full speed, with total confidence that the mountain would hold. The mountain did not hold. A patch of ice above Aspen, a corner she'd taken 100 times before, and then 11 hours of surgery and a diagnosis that told her, in the flat clinical language doctors use when they know there's no good way to say a thing, that she would not walk again. She was 34 years old. She ran a company with 6,000 employees, and she went home to a house with hallways too narrow for a wheelchair and a life she no longer recognized. Jack Mercer, meanwhile, was 300 miles away, teaching his daughter Olivia how to check the oil in a 14-year-old truck, because that was the kind of thing a widowed father taught a 9-year-old when there was no one else to split the lessons with. Jack had been a structural engineer once, the kind who signed off on bridges, but 2 years earlier his wife Renee had died of an aggressive cancer that took 8 months from diagnosis to funeral, and somewhere in the wreckage of that year, Jack had quietly stepped back from a 60-hour-a-week career, because a girl who has already lost her mother should not also lose the only parent she has left to a job. He took contract inspection work when he could get it. He picked up night shifts wherever they'd take him. He told no one at the sites that he used to design the very structures he now just walked and measured, because it never came up, and because he'd learned that a man who mentions what he used to be sounds like a man complaining about what he is now. The two worlds might never have touched at all, if not for a staffing agency in the city that had run out of assistants willing to try the Prescott estate, and had started, out of sheer desperation, posting the night shift caregiver position somewhere outside the usual circles. Home health boards, veteran hiring services, anywhere a steady, patient adult might be looking for work that didn't require a resume full of nursing credentials, just required someone willing to show up. Jack needed the money. Nights worked, because a neighbor 2 doors down, a retired schoolteacher named Dot, who'd more or less adopted Olivia as an honorary grandchild, was glad to have her over for dinner and homework while Jack worked. And Jack could be home again by 6 in the morning to get Olivia up for school. He drove out to the Prescott estate on a gray Tuesday, with no real expectation of getting the job, since the woman on the phone had warned him, with the particular weariness of someone who'd made this call too many times, that the position had a high turnover rate, which Jack understood to mean that whoever lived in that house was going to be very difficult, and that the agency had stopped pretending otherwise. He met Caroline Prescott in the library that had been converted into her primary living space, a room with floor-to-ceiling windows and shelves of books nobody read anymore, because the study upstairs where she used to work was no longer reachable by chair. She did not offer her hand. She looked at him the way she'd looked at the 3 assistants before him, with an expression that dared him to say something well-meaning and useless about her situation. Something about strength or blessings or silver linings, so that she could end the interview in under 2 minutes the way she'd ended the others. Jack didn't say any of that. He asked about the schedule. He asked what she needed help with physically, and what she preferred to do herself, a question none of the previous 4 had thought to ask, because most people who take a caregiving job arrive already deciding how much the disabled person can be trusted to do alone. Caroline answered in clipped, testing sentences, watching him for the flinch, the pity, the overcorrection into cheerfulness that she'd come to expect and despise. It didn't come. He just listened, and wrote a few things down, and asked if there was a night nurse on call for anything medical, because he wanted to be clear about what he was and wasn't qualified for. It was on his way out, his second visit that week, orientation day, that he saw the photograph. It sat on the corner of the desk in the library, angled so it faced Caroline's chair and nowhere else. A small girl, maybe 6, gap-toothed, mid-law, caught in a burst of light that looked like late afternoon in a garden somewhere. The frame was old, the kind with a small hairline crack in the corner glass, the kind of imperfection you'd have replaced years ago if the photograph inside it weren't the only thing that mattered. Every assistant before him had walked past that photograph 40 times a day and never once asked. Some had assumed it was a niece. One had assumed, with the particular tone deafness of someone reading a room only for its furniture, that family photos really warmed the place up and complemented the frame, and Caroline had not spoken to her again, except to fire her 3 days later. Jack looked at the photograph for exactly as long as it takes to notice that someone has arranged a desk around a single object, the way you'd notice a load-bearing wall holding up a house that otherwise looks like it shouldn't stand. He didn't ask about business. He didn't ask about the accident, or the schedule, or anything he'd come there to ask about at all. "Is that your sister?" he said quietly, nodding at the photo. And it wasn't performance. It wasn't a strategy. It was just the plainest guess a stranger could make, looking at a laughing child in an old frame. Caroline Prescott, who had not cried in front of another human being since the week of her daughter's funeral, 4 years before the skiing accident that took her legs, felt something crack open in her chest that she had spent every hour of every day holding shut. Her hands, which had learned to be perfectly steady in board meetings, even as her body betrayed her, began to shake. "No," she said, and her voice broke on the single syllable in a way that 6 weeks of assistance had never once heard. "That's my daughter, Emily. She died when she was 6. The room went very quiet. Jack didn't move to comfort her, didn't reach for her hand, didn't say he was sorry in the automatic way people say it when they want the awkward moment to end. He simply stayed and let her cry, and said only, after a long while, that Emily had a wonderful laugh, which was true, and which was the first thing anyone had said about her daughter in years. That wasn't a careful avoidance of the subject entirely. If you've ever needed someone to simply witness your grief instead of trying to manage it, tell us in the comments. Because so many of the people writing in below this video already know exactly what that moment felt like. For the first time since the accident, and honestly, for the first time since the funeral 4 years before it, Caroline Prescott had been seen not as a wheelchair, not as a company, not as a headline about a tragic skiing accident, but as a mother who missed her child. She did not know, that first week, what to do with a feeling like that. She only knew that she did not want Jack Mercer to leave the way the others had. 11 months would pass before either of them said out loud what that first conversation had actually been the beginning of. The 11 months that followed did not unfold the way anyone watching from the outside might expect. There was no immediate softening, no gentle montage of healing. Caroline Prescott had spent 30 years being the smartest, most controlled person in every room she entered. And grief did not undo 3 decades of habit just because one stranger had asked the right question on the right afternoon. She let Jack stay because he did not flinch, but she tested that non-flinching constantly. The way a person tests a bridge they don't quite believe will hold their weight. She was, by any fair account, difficult. She snapped over rearranged pillows. She refused help she plainly needed, transferring herself from chair to bed with a stubbornness that once left a bruise along her hip she didn't mention until Jack noticed her wincing 3 days later. She held video calls with her board at 2 in the morning because sleep had become an unreliable country she visited only in fragments, and she expected Jack to simply be present and useful at whatever hour she decided to need him, without complaint, without the raised eyebrow of judgment she'd grown so used to from the others. Jack absorbed all of it with the same quiet steadiness he brought to everything. He'd learned patience the hard way, in 8 months of watching Renee's body fail her by inches, while he kept a calm face on for a daughter who was 7 years old and needed her father to seem like the ground would hold, even as it buckled under both of them. Caroline's sharpness didn't frighten him, because he'd already stood in a room with something far worse than sharpness, and come out the other side of it still able to make breakfast the next morning. What did wear on him slowly was the isolation of the house itself. 6,000 employees answered to Caroline Prescott, and not one of them, apart from a handful on her executive team, had spoken to her directly in the 8 months since the accident. Her chief operating officer, a smooth, well-liked executive named Trevor Hale, who had run point on the last 2 major client renewals himself, had taken to handling anything sensitive without troubling her, a phrase he used often and warmly in emails that Jack sometimes glimpsed open on her tablet screen, emails that were unfailingly solicitous and unfailingly vague about exactly which decisions were being made in her name and which were simply being made instead of asking her at all. The breaking point came on a Thursday in the 9th month. During the quarterly board call, Caroline insisted on joining from her library, wheelchair angled toward the screen, voice as sharp and prepared as it had ever been before the accident. She raised a question about a renewal contract with their largest client, a logistic conglomerate whose business made up nearly 1/5 of Prescott Analytics' revenue, a contract she'd noticed, from the financials alone, appeared to have been renegotiated at terms 12% below the prior agreement, without her signature anywhere on the amendment. Trevor Hale's answer came smooth and immediate, the practiced ease of a man who had rehearsed this exact deflection. He explained, in the gentle, patient tone people use on someone they've quietly decided is no longer entirely reliable, that given everything she'd been managing, the executive team hadn't wanted to burden her with the granular details, that the terms were still favorable, that he'd handled it the way she would have wanted. 2 board members nodded along. A third suggested, not unkindly but not without weight, that perhaps it would be wise, going forward, for Caroline to consider stepping back from day-to-day oversight and focusing on recovery, while Trevor continued running operations in her stead. Caroline sat in that meeting and understood, with total clarity, that the company her father had built and she had spent 15 years running was quietly being taken from her, one solicitous, well-meaning sentence at a time, by a man who had learned exactly how to sound helpful while making her irrelevant. She said nothing in the moment. She thanked the board for their time and ended the call, and sat alone in the library for 4 hours afterward, wheelchair facing the window, saying nothing at all, not even to Jack, who kept his distance and simply left tea within reach without a word. 3 days later, in a private call that Trevor Hale had clearly expected to be routine, Caroline was informed gently that the board had voted, in her absence and without her prior knowledge, to appoint Trevor as interim chief executive during her medical leave, with a review of the arrangement to occur once she's had time to fully recover. Trevor delivered the news himself, his voice warm with something that might have passed for compassion in a room with worse lighting. He told her it changed nothing, that her name would remain on the door, that this was simply practical, and that he hoped she understood it came from a place of care. Caroline understood something different. She understood that she had been humiliated in the one place she had never been humiliated before, quietly, efficiently, without a single raised voice, exactly the way she had spent months humiliating every assistant who came through her door. She hung up the phone, and for the first time since the accident, she did not simply go still. She wept, in the ugly, racking way of someone whose body has finally run out of places to hide the grief. And when Jack came in to check on her, drawn by the sound, she did not send him away. She told him everything, the board vote, Trevor's smooth, patient theft of a company her father had built with his own hands, the particular cruelty of being managed instead of consulted, protected instead of trusted, the same cruelty, she realized aloud, that she had been inflicting on every person who'd walked through her door trying to help her, because she'd been so afraid of being handled that she'd handled everyone else first. out of pure preemptive fear. If you've ever been quietly pushed aside by someone who insisted they were only trying to help you, you already know exactly how deep that kind of humiliation cuts. And if this story is bringing something up for you tonight, we'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Jack didn't offer to fix it. He wasn't a lawyer, wasn't a board member, had no leverage over a $4 billion company's governance structure. He simply stayed in the room while she cried, the same way he'd stayed in the room the day she told him about Emily. And when she finally quieted, hoarse and exhausted, he said only that a company built by her father, run for 15 years by her, did not stop being hers just because a man in a nice suit had convinced a boardroom that kindness meant taking it away from her. 8 months would pass, filled with slow, careful, mostly private work, before that stolen company would find its way back into Caroline Prescott's hands. The 8 months that followed changed the shape of the house before they changed the shape of the company. It was in month 2 of that stretch that Jack, needing childcare on a week when Dot the neighbor had a hip replacement scheduled, asked Caroline if it would be all right to bring Olivia along after school a few afternoons, just to do homework quietly in the library while he worked. Caroline, who had spent 4 years unable to be in a room with a child without her chest seizing, surprised herself by saying yes. Olivia Mercer was 9 years old, unself-conscious in the particular way of children who have already learned that adults are not as put together as they pretend to be, having watched her own father hold an entire household up through a year of losing her mother. She did not treat Caroline's wheelchair as something to tiptoe around, and she did not treat Caroline's sharpness as something to fear. Within a week, she was asking Caroline to check her math homework, on the grounds that, "Dad says you used to run numbers for a giant company, so you're probably good at this." And within 3 weeks, she had reorganized an entire bookshelf in the library by color instead of subject, informing Caroline with total confidence that it looked happier now. Caroline found herself, for the first time in 4 years, laughing, actually laughing, at a 9-year-old's utterly serious explanation of why the mansion needed a dog. It was a small thing, and it changed nothing about the boardroom, and it changed almost everything about the house. The estate that had been a place of grief and management for 4 years slowly began to sound, in the after-school hours, like a home again. It was Olivia, unknowingly, who cracked the second problem open. Doing homework at the library table one afternoon, she'd asked Caroline, with a child's total lack of tact, why the tall man who talks like a TV commercial kept coming by with folders for Caroline to sign without really explaining what was in them. Caroline had laughed it off in the moment, but the observation stuck with her the way a splinter does, small and impossible to ignore once you've noticed it's there. She began quietly to look more carefully at what Trevor Hale actually put in front of her to sign. She asked her longtime executive assistant, a sharp, careful woman named Priya Anand, who had stayed loyal through all of it despite Trevor's none too subtle attempts to have her reassigned, to pull the original contract terms on the logistics renewal, alongside every amendment filed in the 8 months since the accident. What Priya found, working quietly and after hours so as not to alert anyone in Trevor's growing circle of allies, was a pattern of amendments that consistently shifted margin and long-term equity value toward a shell consulting entity that, 3 layers of ownership down, traced back to a company Trevor Hale's brother-in-law controlled. It wasn't dramatic theft in the way board scandals are usually imagined. It was slow, patient siphoning, dressed in the language of strategic partnership fees and implementation consulting, each individual amendment defensible on its own. The pattern only visible once someone assembled all of it side by side, which was precisely why Trevor had been careful to keep Caroline from seeing any single piece of it at once. Caroline brought the documents to Jack one night after Olivia had fallen asleep on the library sofa over a half-finished worksheet, because she found, to her own quiet surprise, that she trusted his judgment more than she trusted anyone left in her professional life. Jack was no forensic accountant, but he understood structural failure the way few people did, the way small, individually acceptable deviations compound silently until the whole system gives way at once. He looked at the numbers with an engineer's eye for load-bearing weakness and told her plainly that whatever this was, it wasn't a mistake, it was a design. Caroline reached out, carefully and secretly, to 2 board members she still trusted. women who had known her father and had voted for the interim arrangement out of genuine concern rather than complicity, and asked them, without yet naming Trevor, to authorize an independent audit of the last year's major contract amendments. It was granted quietly, framed internally as routine compliance review, and it began the slow work of building a case that could not be waved away as a wounded executive's grudge. The secondary crisis arrived 3 weeks into that audit, when Trevor Hale, sensing the ground shifting though not yet understanding why, moved to formalize his position, presenting the board with a proposal to convert his interim role into a permanent CEO appointment, citing operational continuity and framing Caroline's ongoing medical situation as reason enough to make the arrangement permanent rather than temporary. It was a direct, aggressive move, timed for a board meeting just 5 weeks away, and if it passed, the audit already underway might never see daylight at all, buried under a new CEO's authority to simply end it. Caroline understood she was now in a race against a clock Trevor had set without knowing she'd noticed it ticking. She had the beginnings of proof. She did not yet have enough to stop a vote that could make his theft permanent and unreviewable. And for the first time in 8 months, watching Jack help Olivia with a bowl of cereal in her own kitchen at midnight while she stared at spreadsheets that might not be ready in time, Caroline Prescott understood that she was no longer fighting only for the company. She was fighting for the only version of her life that had felt like her own again since the accident, and she was terrified of losing both at once. Some might say a woman in her position should have spoken up the moment she noticed the numbers didn't add up rather than waiting quietly to be sure. Others would say that speaking too soon, without proof, against a man the board already trusted would have cost her everything before she'd built a case strong enough to survive being doubted. It's worth wondering, watching her wait in that library at midnight, which choice you'd have made in her place. 5 weeks would pass before that board vote arrived, and neither Caroline nor Jack yet knew whether the truth would be ready in time to meet it. The 5 weeks that followed were the hardest of the entire ordeal. Harder in some ways than the accident itself, because the accident had at least been a single catastrophic event with a clear before and after, while this was a slow, grinding race against a deadline that refused to move. Priya worked nights pulling every filing, every wire transfer record, every email thread Trevor Hale had CC'd himself out of at just the right moment to look uninvolved. Caroline spent her days on calls with the 2 board members she trusted, building the case piece by piece, and her evenings, more and more, simply existing in the company of Jack and Olivia, who had become, without either of them naming it, something closer to family than employee and employer. It was Jack, oddly enough, who found the piece that finally closed the case shut. Reviewing a stack of physical documents Caroline had asked him to help carry down from an upstairs storage room she could no longer reach herself, he noticed, with the same engineer's attention to inconsistency that had once caught microfractures in load-bearing beams before they became visible failures, that one of the Shell Consulting entity's registered addresses matched, almost exactly, an address he recognized from an old inspection job years earlier. A small commercial building he'd once certified for occupancy, owned at the time by a name he now recognized from the audit files as Trevor Hale's brother-in-law. It was a small, mundane detail, the kind that means nothing to most people, and everything to someone trained to notice what doesn't line up. And it gave Priya the final thread she needed to trace the entire ownership structure back, cleanly and provably, to Trevor himself. With the case complete, Caroline made a decision that surprised even Priya. Rather than releasing the findings quietly to end Trevor's career in a private settlement, the way most boards prefer to handle these things to avoid embarrassment, Caroline insisted the full audit be presented at the very board meeting Trevor had scheduled to make his position permanent, in front of every board member who had spent 8 months quietly deciding she was too fragile to be trusted with her own company. The meeting, when it came, unfolded exactly as she'd planned it. Trevor opened with his prepared remarks on operational continuity, confident, smooth, entirely unaware that the room already contained a printed copy of the full forensic audit in front of every board member present. Caroline let him finish. She did not raise her voice. She simply asked the board's independent counsel to walk the room through the findings, page by page, while Trevor's practiced calm cracked in slow, visible increments his explanations growing longer and less coherent as each new document made the pattern undeniable, until the two board members who had nominated him for the permanent role sat in absolute silence, unable to look at him at all. He resigned before the board could vote to remove him, which everyone in the room understood was simply a more dignified word for the same outcome. Caroline Prescott was reinstated as Chief Executive Officer of Prescott Analytics that same afternoon, unanimously, by a board that 4 hours earlier had been prepared to make her irrelevant. It should have felt like triumph, and in part it did, but what Caroline noticed most, driving home from that meeting in a car retrofitted for her chair, was how little the win itself moved her, compared to the thought of getting back to a house where a 9-year-old girl would ask about her day, and a quiet man would have dinner waiting without needing to be asked. The company had been the wound for 8 months, but somewhere in that stretch, without either of them planning it, the house had become the thing she was actually racing home to protect. She arrived to find Jack in the kitchen, flour on his hands, teaching Olivia to roll dough for a recipe Renee used to make, something he did more often now than he had in the 2 years since his wife's death, because grief, he'd found, softened when it had somewhere warm to sit. Caroline told them both what had happened, plainly, without the polish she used in boardrooms, and Olivia, entirely unimpressed by the corporate drama and entirely delighted by the outcome, asked if this meant Caroline could come to her school's spring assembly next month, since her dad always came but her mom never got to anymore, and it would be nice to have someone else there too. Caroline Prescott, $4 billion restored to her name that same afternoon, found that the moment which actually undid her, quietly, in the middle of her own kitchen, was a 9-year-old asking her to sit in a folding chair at an elementary school assembly. 1 month later, an ordinary Thursday evening would bring a conversation that had been building, unspoken, for nearly a year. The board scheduled a formal announcement for the following week, a press release restoring Caroline Prescott fully and publicly to her position, alongside a brief, carefully worded statement regarding leadership changes that named Trevor Hale only in the barest legal necessity. Caroline insisted on one addition to the announcement that her communications team found puzzling: a public acknowledgement, unusual for a company of that size, thanking the employees who had quietly maintained the integrity of client relationships during a period of internal uncertainty, specifically naming Priya Anand's contribution to the audit, ensuring that the one person who had stayed loyal through the entire ordeal would not simply disappear back into an assistant's job with no one the wiser about what she'd risked to help. The board, in the same meeting, offered Caroline something showy: an apology for the 8 months of doubt, a formal resolution establishing a personal security detail, an expanded budget for what one board member called executive comfort accommodations, language that Caroline understood plainly as an attempt to make the humiliation disappear under the weight of expensive gestures. She declined all of it. What she asked for instead was smaller, and to the board's visible surprise, harder to simply write a check for: a permanent, board-level accessibility review of every Prescott Analytics office and facility, conducted by outside consultants with lived disability experience, and a standing requirement that any executive decision made on behalf of a leader on medical leave require that leaders documented contemporaneous sign-off, not a retroactive summary delivered after the fact. She wanted the structure changed, not her own discomfort quietly bought off. The quiet coda came 3 weeks later, on an ordinary Thursday evening in early autumn, the kind of evening that gets no special mention in anyone's calendar except in hindsight. Olivia was at Dot's for a sleepover, and the house was unusually still, the way it had been in the earliest days, before a 9-year-old's laughter had filled its hallways again. Jack found Caroline in the library, in the same spot she'd been in the very first day they met, chair angled toward the window, the photograph of Emily still on the corner of the desk, though it faced outward now, toward the room, rather than only toward her chair, the way it had for 4 locked-away years. "You moved it," Jack said, nodding at the frame. "I got tired of being the only one who got to see her," Caroline said. And there was no crack in her voice this time, only something steadier, something that had finally found a place to rest. She told him, that evening, in the plain, unhurried way people speak when they've stopped performing for each other, that she had spent 4 years defining herself entirely by 2 facts: that she had lost her daughter, and that she had lost the use of her legs, and that everyone who'd come near her in that time had either flinched from both of those facts or tried to manage them, until a man who'd lost someone too had simply sat with her in the wreckage of it and asked one honest question instead of 100 careful ones. She did not ask him to fix anything this time either. She asked him, quietly, whether he thought there might be room in a life built around a 9-year-old's homework and a nightly caregiving schedule for something that wasn't a job description anymore. Jack, who had spent 2 years since Renee's death believing that the only love left available to him was the fierce, singular love of raising his daughter alone, found that he did not need long to answer her. They did not marry that year, or even announce anything publicly, understanding that grief and recovery both move at their own unhurried pace, and that some things are worth protecting from an audience. But by the following spring, Caroline Prescott sat in a folding chair at an elementary school assembly, Jack on one side of her and an empty chair on the other left, unspoken, for Renee's memory, and Olivia stood on a small stage and waved directly at both of them before her class began to sing, and Caroline found that she was crying again for the second time in that house, though this time the tears came from something closer to fullness than to grief. The photograph on the desk stayed facing outward from then on, a small, cracked frame holding a laughing 6-year-old. No longer a private grief kept locked away from the world, but a life that had finally been allowed back into the light, alongside everything that came after it. If you've ever underestimated how much it matters simply to be seen, fully, wheelchair and grief and all, rather than managed or fixed or handled from a careful distance, this story was for you tonight. Has there been someone in your own life who needed exactly that? Someone you loved who was drowning quietly behind a closed door, waiting for one person to ask the real question instead of the easy one. Tell us about them in the comments, even if all you can offer now is finally saying their name and what they meant to you. If you believe that the people who've been overlooked, the ones written off as too difficult, too broken, too much to handle, deserve someone willing to stay in the room anyway, consider staying with us here too. Because there are so many more of these stories still to tell, and we'd love to have you with us for the next one.